Here, millions of people are forced to abandon their homes and livelihoods to make space for economic development. In a developing country, the building of a bridge can ensure medical supplies reach the most vulnerable. A dam can keep farmlands from flooding in rainy seasons. The construction of various projects is necessary for a government to ensure a prosperous future for its people. But based on a recent investigation, apparently not everyone. A recent exposé published by the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists and its media partners has revealed that in the course of a single decade, nearly 3.5 million people were evicted from their homes, torn away from their lands, or otherwise displaced by projects funded by the World Bank. Joining us now to discuss the World Bank's resettlement program from Ottawa, Canada, is Paul Cadario. He spent nearly 20 years as a senior manager with the World Bank and is now a fellow at the University of Toronto. Joining me in the studio is Sasha Chavkin, the award-winning reporter and lead author behind Evicted and Abandoned, an investigation into the World Bank's resettlement policy. Thanks to both of you for joining us. Sasha, let me start with you. This is a pretty devastating report that you and your co-authors have produced here. Millions of people displaced, their livelihoods torn away. What are the main takeaways from this report?
It's good to be with you, Anand. So our report focused on the World Bank, the world's preeminent development lender. As you mentioned, the World Bank now spends more than $60 billion each year funding roads and power plants and health programs and other vitally important development projects in poor countries. When the World Bank funds a project, it promises, among other things, that people who are displaced by that project will have their living conditions restored to equal or better than they were before the project. What our investigation found is that the World Bank hasn't lived up to that promise. Since 2004, we found that an estimated 3.4 million people were physically or economically displaced by World Bank-funded projects, which means, according to the definition set forth in the World Bank's policies, that they lost their homes, some or all of their land, or their livelihoods were damaged. We found that the bank has not been enforcing its policies to ensure that those people's living conditions are restored and that they're protected from abuses such as violent evictions when they are displaced.
So they ended up even worse off than they were before?
We don't know what happened in every case. What we do know is that there are 3.4 million people who are displaced in some way, and the World Bank has regularly failed to follow its policies for protecting those people and restoring them to the conditions where they were living in before.
Right. Paul, you were a manager at the World Bank. You were on the inside when some of these policies were discussed. What did you make of this report?
Well, I thank you for inviting me today, and I think that ICIJ did a great service in looking at some of the extreme cases where clearly governments did not conduct or implement resettlement correctly. Where I part company with ICIJ's otherwise excellent reporting, and I think very timely reporting, is the headline that says, or that implies, all 3.4 million people were adversely affected. And they've not, in their reporting, demonstrated any evidence of that, so that the reader who's faced with excellent database of publicly available information, which the World Bank makes available as part of its way of doing business, are given to understand that all these projects failed, that 3.4 million people had irreparable harm done to them. That is not established in the reporting, and I'd be surprised if it happened.
Sasha,
nonetheless, it did point out areas for improvement, and that's very, very important for the World Bank at this time.
You want to address that, Sasha?
Yeah, I would be glad to. That isn't what our reporting found or stated. We found that, as I said, an estimated 3.4 million people were physically or economically displaced. We didn't say that none of them were resettled. We didn't say that all of them were violently evicted. We said that there was this huge portion, this huge population that was displaced, and that the World Bank has regularly failed to implement the policies that protect them. To give one example, an internal 2014 report by the World Bank found that in a sample of cases, 60% of the time, the World Bank failed to keep track of what happened to the people who were displaced by its projects. Now, you can't restore people's homes or protect them from abuses if you're not even keeping track of who they are and what's happening to them.
Paul, go ahead.
Well, Sasha, as you and I have discussed twice now, I don't take issue with the fact that the World Bank does not collect the names and cell phone numbers of the people who are displaced by projects the governments that borrow money from the World Bank undertake, and that are supposed to undertake in accordance with safeguard policies that, of course, are now under review. And in fact, the disagreement or the concern that I have, and I think the bank has, is about the way your media partners have used the headline, which gives the reader, who does not go through the 6 case studies you've very well documented, gives the impression that all these people were negatively impacted by these projects and in an irrevocable way. Now, it is true that the bank's requirements do not insist that the bank keep track of everybody who's moved. No financing entity does that. Governments should, and indeed the history of development in most countries is that the roads, the bridges, as Anand said in his intro, the dams, the power plants have caused people to be evicted. Heavens, my grandmother was evicted from her home because the priest in a place near Ottawa wanted to move his house. So that there is economic dislocation. At the same time, I think we have to be very careful in looking at the 3.4 million as if it were a hard number, because it's not. And even if you add up the number of people in the 6 projects, which you've so well documented, I'd be surprised if the number of people affected in those 6 was more than maybe 35,000. That's not to say that's an acceptable number, particularly under the circumstances of some of those projects. But I think the headline it provides a misleading context to the difficult things that sometimes go on when governments decide to do projects that are intended to have a positive economic impact on people's lives.
Right, Paul, who is responsible for the resettlement of people when you have a project that has been adopted by the World Bank, that's been accepted by a national government? Who's responsible for the resettlement of those people? Is it national governments? Is it the World Bank? Does the World Bank set conditions? Does the World Bank have some kind of mechanism to ensure that those conditions are met, that it's done, in the words of the World Bank, in a humane way?
Well, governments are responsible for implementing projects of all kinds, whether they borrow the money from the World Bank or they fund it internally. The World Bank, since the 80s, has had a series of a set of environmental and social safeguards which must be followed in any project that is, by its design or by its implementation method, going to have an adverse impact on people. That is resettlement, it affects cultural property, it affects Indigenous people. There's a set of 8 environmental and social safeguards that address the sorts of issues that the ICIJ looked into. But governments are responsible for implementing the projects in a way that's consistent with the safeguards. The bank's responsibility is to ensure that though the governments do that by making sure that the project design embodies those safeguards and that the project, while it's being implemented, is carried out the way it was designed. I think we are going to come to what I think are flaws, apparently, in how some of these projects actually proceeded and the areas for improvement for the bank. But certainly governments are responsible for what goes on in their territory. And the World Bank is under the obligation in its operational policies for making sure that those undertakings by governments are met.
Sasha, what were your findings? You just heard Paul say there that there are safeguards which the World Bank maintains, and these safeguards must be followed, as Paul said. Did you find that they were followed?
We found that the World Bank regularly did not enforce or follow its safeguard policies. As Paul said, it's governments that implement these projects, but what the bank's obligations are are to ensure that when World Bank money is being used, that World Bank safeguards are followed. We found cases of violent evictions where homes were burned, where people were beaten and raped. We found cases where whole communities of people saw their livelihoods diminished by pollution, for example, from a power plant that was spewing warm water into the ocean off the coast of India. We found that in many cases, World Bank clients violated the bank's safeguard policies and continued to receive money from the World Bank after this happened. So, of course, a lot of responsibility is in the hands of the governments themselves. You know, we're not suggesting the World Bank is doing these things or that they would ever want something like this to happen. But there's a question of whether there's any kind of accountability enforced by the bank when its clients violate their rules.
Paul?
Well, I think, Anand, yeah. let me just respond to that.
Okay.
Sasha's used the term regularly on a sample of 6 projects, which were well documented and I think very thoroughly researched by his colleagues. He also used the term often, and I don't know whether there's evidence for often in what he's saying, and that's where I really part company with the way this story's been reported, that on the basis of 6 well-reported stories that talk about, I think, fairly egregious action by the government and, in one case, a private investor, that there was either there was inadequate preparation of the project, or the World Bank did not, and the International Finance Corporation, its private sector affiliate, did not follow the World Bank Group's own rules about what was to be followed and what was to be done. But it is not fair, and there is no evidence to extrapolate on the basis of these 6 projects to cover the whole 3.4 million or every project that the World Bank and indeed other development partners have financed that has involved the physical displacement of people.
Okay.
I could cite a couple of others if you want even worse examples.
Well, let me give Sasha a chance
the ones that ICIJ looked at.
Okay, let me give Sasha a chance to respond to what you've been saying. Go ahead.
Thanks, Anand. So the 6 projects that we examined in depth, we believe are indicative of more deep-seated problems. And that's not based on drawing generalizations from 6 projects, but rather from a comprehensive analysis we did of more than 6,000 project documents over the course of 10 years. What we found, for example, is that the majority of projects now in which the World Bank triggers its policy indicating that displacement is likely, they don't end up preparing a detailed resettlement action plan. Now, the bank says in many cases resettlement doesn't take place in these projects, but most often they fail to document that. So what our reporting found is that while there were a few cases we examined in depth, it was a much broader data analysis that suggested there were more systemic problems in the bank's resettlement policy.
Paul, the bank has obviously seen this report. What has been the bank's response to it?
Well, the bank can speak for itself, Anand, and I'm sorry that there's no one from the bank available to talk to it, be with us today. The bank, I think, acknowledged that there are systemic issues, and certainly, as Sasha and I have discussed over coffee in Washington, the fact that projects that involve resettlement have often proceeded without detailed plans, and that, in other words, a resettlement policy framework, I think it's called, is something that I was surprised to read, because that isn't the way the bank used to operate. And obviously, if you're using a resettlement framework, it might be that you don't need it. As you just said, and Sasha said, well, some of the projects don't involve resettlement. Then it's up to the bank to document. We thought there was going to be resettlement. We found there isn't going to be any. Documented, government documents it, bank signs off, end of story. But I think there is a systemic problem if the bank is prepared to say, okay, well, we don't know that there's going to be resettlement. There might be, so we'll have a framework. And then to say nothing about whether there was or wasn't, I think suggests a certain systemic problem. The use of resettlement frameworks itself is risky, because you're signing off on the ability of a government to prepare an acceptable plan after the loan has been approved, and once the project has gotten started. And as ICIJ showed, there are some governments that just don't operate that way. Again, there's something about the thoroughness of the World Bank Group's investigation of these projects before they're appraised that I think that I'm glad has been revealed, and I'm glad that the bank is looking to improve.